My name is Tegan Miller, 32 years old, a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy. I stood there, in the familiar VFW hall back home, the air thick with the smell of fried chicken and memory. But the sudden silence was heavier. My father, Colonel Robert Miller, the man this whole town worshipped, looked straight at me, and his voice rang out like a judge's gavel. "She has been nothing but a disappointment to me." The words landed, one by one. To twist the knife, he turned away, placed his hand on the shoulder of a young Navy SEAL, and declared, "This is a man who understands duty." His smirk was the final cut. But then, the SEAL looked at me, his face pale. In a trembling voice, he asked the question that lit the fuse. "Ma'am, are you the Black Widow of the SEALs? If you've ever had to fight for the recognition you deserve from your own family, let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button and subscribe. Because this isn't just my story, it's ours." The heavy glass door of the VFW post in Fayetteville, North Carolina, swung shut behind me, muffling the evening sounds of home. Inside, the air was a familiar assault on the senses. A thick, warm blanket woven from the smells of crispy fried chicken, creamy potato salad, and the unmistakable scent of cheap domestic beer being poured from a tap. It was the smell of every community event, every fundraiser, every Friday night of my childhood. It was supposed to smell like belonging. Tonight, it felt like a trap. I kept my shoulders back, my posture a reflex drilled into me at Annapolis. A few familiar faces, old friends of my father's, glanced up from their beers. I offered a tight, polite nod. They returned it, but their eyes slid away a moment too soon. A subtle, awkward dance of men who didn't know what to say to the colonel's daughter. The air around me felt charged with an unspoken narrative, one I wasn't privy to but could feel all the same. And then I saw him. My father, Colonel Robert Miller, retired, stood in the center of the room. He wasn't just a man in a room, he was a planet, and everyone else was a moon caught in his orbit. He was laughing, a deep rumbling sound that commanded attention, his hand resting on the shoulder of a young man in civilian clothes who still carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of a warrior. My father was a general holding court with his soldiers. His eyes, sharp and blue like chips of ice, swept the room and found me. For a single, fleeting second, they rested on my face. There was no recognition, no warmth, not even a flicker of acknowledgement. His gaze simply passed over me, continuing its sweep as if I were just another part of the wood-paneled walls, another faded photograph of forgotten heroes. That invisibility, that casual erasure of my existence, hurt more than any shouted reprimand ever could. It was a clean, silent cut, deep and precise. I exhaled slowly, a controlled release of pressure, and found myself in an empty corner near a dusty display case filled with medals and folded flags. From here, I could observe without being part of the scene. I felt like a foreign operative on a reconnaissance mission in what was supposed to be my own hometown. The sense of alienation was profound, a cold weight settling in my chest. I was home, but I had never felt more lost. The low hum of conversation quieted as the town mayor, a balding man with a perpetually eager smile, stepped up to a small podium. He tapped the microphone, a squeal of feedback echoing through the hall. "Evening, everyone. Evening. It's an honor to be here tonight to celebrate one of Fayetteville's finest sons, a man who embodies service, honor, and legacy. Colonel Robert Miller." A round of hearty applause filled the room. I watched my father nod, accepting the praise as his due. The mayor was about to present him with a plaque, naming him Honorary Citizen of the Year. The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth. The mayor began his speech, a string of well-worn platitudes about duty and sacrifice. But before he could get more than a few sentences in, my father raised a hand. He didn't ask for permission to speak, he commanded it. The mayor trailed off, confused but obliging. "Before we continue," my father said, his voice booming, carrying to every corner of the hall without the need for a microphone. "I'd like to clear something up." The room fell utterly silent. The clinking of forks on paper plates stopped. The shuffling of feet ceased. Every eye turned to him, then followed his gaze directly to my corner. I felt 100 pairs of eyes land on me, and my training was the only thing that kept me from flinching. I stood perfectly still, my expression neutral, a mask of calm I'd perfected over a decade of service. My daughter, Tegan, is also here tonight, he announced. The words were simple, but the tone was chilling. Many of you have asked me if I'm proud, if her career makes me proud. He paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the anticipation build into something heavy and cruel. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. He looked right at me, his eyes devoid of any warmth. The answer is no. The words struck me with the force of a physical blow. A collective, quiet gasp rippled through the crowd. The air crackled with their shock, with my humiliation. My face burned, but I refused to look away. I would not give him the satisfaction. He wasn't finished. She has been nothing but a disappointment to me, he declared, his voice ringing with cold finality. A paper-pushing career, that's not a real soldier. Then, as if I no longer existed, he turned his back on me. The public execution was complete. He immediately pivoted to the young man beside him, the Navy SEAL, whose name I now knew was Remy. My father's entire demeanor shifted. The ice in his voice melted, replaced by a booming paternal pride that I had craved my entire life. But this young man, he said, clapping Remy on the shoulder. This is the legacy a father hopes for, a real warrior, a member of the finest fighting force the world has ever known. The crowd, released from its stunned silence, erupted in applause. It was a wave of validation for my father's cruelty, a social permission slip for my public disgrace. Remy looked deeply uncomfortable, his gaze darting towards me with a flicker of apology. But my father paid him no mind. He just smirked at me over Remy's shoulder, a cruel, triumphant curl of his lip. The message was unmistakable, delivered with brutal efficiency. You see, you are a waste. In that moment of absolute humiliation, my eyes met Remy's. The polite confidence in his face was gone, replaced by something else. Disbelief, confusion, and then a dawning, shocking recognition. He took a half-step forward, an involuntary movement toward me, ignoring the proprietary hand my father still had clamped on his shoulder. His voice was not loud, but in the sudden lull after the applause, it cut through the air, trembling, but perfectly clear. "Ma'am," he started, his eyes locked on mine. "I'm sorry, but are you the Black Widow of the SEALs?" The applause died as if a switch had been flipped. The shuffling stopped. The breathing seemed to stop. The entire room held its breath, suspended in a state of collective shock. My father's triumphant smirk froze on his face, the expression cracking, shattering into a mask of pure, unadulterated confusion. The foundation of the world he had just built, with me on the outside, had just been rocked by an earthquake. The balance of power in the room had just tilted, dramatically and irrevocably. That one question from Remy, "Are you the Black Widow?" acted like a key, unlocking a door to the past I had long kept sealed. Standing there in the buzzing silence of the VFW hall, the present dissolved, and I was adrift in the sea of memory. Pulled back to the place where it all began, the small, sterile house near Fort Bragg. Our house never smelled like a home. Other kids' houses smelled of baking chocolate chip cookies or cinnamon. Ours smelled of shoe polish and bitter black coffee. It was less a home and more a forward operating base where my father was the commanding officer and I was the permanent, underperforming cadet. There was order, there was discipline, but there was no warmth. The first lesson he ever taught me wasn't how to ride a bike. It was how to salute. I was 6 years old, my small hand clumsy and unsure as I tried to mimic the crisp, precise angle of his. He'd correct my form with a sharp tap to my elbow, his voice devoid of patience. "Again, Miller," he would command, using our last name as if my first was a privilege I hadn't yet earned. Dinners were the worst. We'd sit at the polished mahogany table, the silence as thick and oppressive as the humidity of a North Carolina summer. It felt like a mission briefing where no one had anything to report. I learned to eat quickly and quietly, to make myself as small as possible. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, counting down the seconds until I could be dismissed. But there was one small act of rebellion in that dictatorship of discipline: my mother, Martha. Every night, after I'd retreated to my room, she would slip in and place a single Hershey's chocolate bar under my pillow. She'd do it without a word, just a soft smile and a gentle squeeze of my shoulder. It was a secret treaty of love, a silent acknowledgement that she saw the little girl drowning beneath the soldier my father was trying to build. That small square of chocolate was my only proof that affection existed within those walls. I remember when I was 12, I found a stray puppy. A scruffy little terrier mix with one floppy ear and boundless energy. I named him Rusty. For 2 weeks, he was my secret, my co-conspirator. I'd sneak him food from the kitchen and play with him in the woods behind our house. He was the first living thing that had ever looked at me with pure, uncomplicated adoration. He was my first taste of unconditional love. Then, my father found him. I came home from school one day to find Rusty's leash on the kitchen counter and an empty space where his water bowl had been. When I asked where he was, my father didn't even look up from cleaning his service pistol. "I took it to the pound," he said, his voice flat. Tears streamed down my face. I begged him, pleaded with him to go back and get Rusty. I promised I'd take perfect care of him. He finally stopped what he was doing and looked at me, his eyes cold and hard. "An officer has no room for weakness," he said, his voice like chipping ice. "You have to learn to cut things away. Attachments are a liability." He wasn't just talking about a dog. He was giving me a lesson about myself, about the parts of me he found unacceptable. I learned that day that in my father's world, love was just another word for weakness. 3 years later, that lesson was reinforced. I was 15, sitting at that same silent dinner table. I had spent months dreaming, researching, and finally building up the courage. I took a deep breath. "Dad," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "I want to apply to the Naval Academy, to Annapolis." He was reading the Wall Street Journal, the paper held up like a fortress between us. He didn't lower it. He didn't even flinch. His voice came from behind the page, muffled and dismissive. "The Navy needs men who can lead, Tegan, not girls who want to play war." The words slammed a door in my face, the sound of it echoing in the silence. My dream, so bright and full of hope just a moment before, was now just a pile of ash on the floor. I felt the familiar sting of not being good enough, not being the right gender, not being the son he always wanted. But later that night, my mother came into my room. She sat on the edge of my bed and took my hand. "An eagle doesn't ask for permission to fly, my love," she whispered, her voice a warm current in the cold house. "It just spreads its wings." Her words were the spark. With her quiet help, I secretly prepared my application. I studied for the SATs until my eyes burned, wrote essays late into the night, and pushed myself in sports. I was accepted. The official acceptance letter, thick and embossed with the Academy's seal, felt heavier than any medal. I placed it on the dining room table, right next to his plate, my heart pounding. He came home, saw the envelope, and picked it up. He read the letter, his face an unreadable mask. For a moment, a wild, foolish hope flared in my chest. Maybe now, I thought. Maybe this is enough. He folded the letter, placed it neatly back in the envelope, and pushed it to the side. "Your dinner is getting cold," was all he said. He didn't come to my high school graduation. The day I left for basic training, the day I was supposed to begin the life he'd modeled for me, he didn't even come to the door. I saw him for a fleeting moment, a silhouette standing at the living room window, watching as I climbed onto the bus. There was no wave, no word of farewell. Just a shadow in a window. As the bus pulled away, I looked back at that house one last time. The sadness I expected to feel wasn't there. In its place was a cold, hard resolve, a determination forged in the fire of his rejection. I would build a legacy of my own, one so undeniable that even he wouldn't be able to ignore it. I would become someone he couldn't just look past. The only thing he couldn't take from me was my mother's legacy. Before I left, she had given me her old, dog-eared copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. Inside the front cover, her elegant handwriting had underlined a single sentence. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. That was the real inheritance I carried with me. Not my father's cold medals or his rigid sense of honor, but my mother's quiet, unbreakable resilience. That was the code I would live by. If you've ever had someone try to put you in a box you didn't belong in, hit that like button. And if you had a secret supporter like my mother, comment with a single word. Eagle. Let's see how many of us learn to fly on our own. But sitting on that bus, clutching that book, a cold dread washed over me. I was finally on my way, but I had to wonder, was I running toward a fight I could never win? The question hanging in my mind on that bus leaving Fayetteville, was I running toward a fight I could never win, found its answer not in a single moment, but over years of relentless effort in a world that wasn't built for me. After graduating from the academy and proving myself in intelligence, I was eventually assigned to a joint task force, detailed to the Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado, California, the home of the Navy SEALs. The moment I walked onto that base, I knew the fight had just begun. It was like stepping into a world of giants. These men were titans, carved from granite and forged in crucibles I could only imagine. And then there was me, a 5'6" intelligence officer. They didn't just look at me, they looked through me. The skepticism was a physical presence in every room I entered, a wall of doubt I had to scale every single day. In the mission briefing rooms, the air thick with testosterone and the smell of stale coffee, my voice often felt like it was absorbed by the soundproofing on the walls. I would present my analysis, my data-driven projections, and the operators would listen with a polite, vacant patience before turning to one another to discuss the real plan. Behind my back, I heard one of the younger SEALs call me the school teacher. I never confronted him. I knew that in this world, words were cheap currency. Respect wasn't given, it was earned, and results were the only legal tender. So, I worked. I let my anger, my frustration, and the ghost of my father's disapproval become fuel. I channeled it all into the work. My intelligence reports became more detailed, my threat assessments more precise, my predictions unnervingly accurate. I was the first one in the office and the last one to leave. I chose to be a ghost, a silent, efficient machine, believing that eventually the quality of my work would become too loud to ignore. The crucible came in the form of a hostage rescue mission in Yemen. The intelligence was a mess, a chaotic jumble of conflicting reports. An American engineer had been taken, and the window to get him back was closing fast. The teams were gearing up for a high-risk, direct action raid on a suspected compound. A plan that had a high probability of casualties on both sides. It felt wrong. It felt like a guess. I barricaded myself in the sensitive compartmented information facility, the SCIF, for 72 hours straight. Fueled by black coffee and a cold, burning determination, I dove into the raw signals intelligence. I listened to hours of meaningless radio chatter, stared at satellite imagery until the pixels blurred, and cross-referenced every piece of data. Everyone else saw noise. I was looking for a pattern. And then I found it. A faint, recurring blip in the insurgents' radio communications. It was a specific sequence of clicks, transmitted at irregular intervals. It wasn't random. It was a signal. By mapping the time and location of each transmission, I started to see a shape emerge from the chaos. I grabbed a marker and turned to the massive whiteboard, my hands moving with a certainty I didn't know I possessed. I drew lines, connected nodes, and mapped out a complex web of data points. "They're not holding him in the compound," I announced at the emergency briefing, my voice cutting through the tense silence. I pointed to the whiteboard, a chaotic-looking diagram that now resembled a spider's web. "It's a decoy. They're moving him. These clicks are signals for the handoff. They're going to move the hostage in the next 6 hours through this alleyway here." The room was silent. A dozen operators stared at my board. The team leader, a seasoned Master Chief named Hill, a man with a face like a roadmap of every conflict since the Cold War, squinted at my drawing. He traced the lines with his finger and muttered, just loud enough for me to hear, "Looks like a damn spider web." That was the moment of truth. He could have dismissed it, stuck to the original plan. Every instinct of an operator is to trust what they can see, what they can touch. I was asking them to trust a ghost in the machine, a pattern no one else saw. Hill looked from the board to me, his eyes searching my face. I held his gaze, my expression unwavering. I didn't plead, I didn't argue. I just let the work speak for itself. He turned to his team. You heard her. We're changing the plan. We set the ambush. They didn't raid the compound. They set up a silent, invisible perimeter around the dusty alleyway I'd identified. And just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, exactly as the data predicted, 2 vehicles arrived. The handoff was swift, quiet, and walked directly into the trap. The hostage was recovered without a single shot being fired. It was a perfect, silent victory, one not with explosives, but with information. When the team returned to Coronado, the atmosphere was different. The skepticism was gone, replaced by a quiet, profound respect. They looked at me, and for the first time, they saw me. Hill walked over, his boots heavy on the concrete floor. You spun the web, he said, his voice a low gravel. And they never saw the silk. He paused, then gave a slight nod. We go into the lion's den, but you're the one who keeps the lions from biting. From now on, that's what we'll call you. And just like that, the name was born. Not the school teacher. Not Miller. The Black Widow? It wasn't a name meant to be fearsome. It was a mark of trust. It meant I was their protector, the one who saw the invisible threats, the one who spun the web that kept them safe. A few months later, my commanding officer, a man who had been a close friend of my father's and had made my life subtly difficult from day one, was being transferred. He'd give me the garbage assignments, the intelligence dead ends, hoping I'd fail. On his last day, he called me into his office. He looked tired, defeated. I was wrong about you, Miller, he admitted, refusing to meet my eyes. He fiddled with a pen on his desk. Your father. He called me when you were first assigned here. He told me to teach you a lesson. Said this place was no place for you. He finally looked up, a flicker of grudging respect in his eyes. But you ended up teaching all of us a lesson. A lesson in professionalism. The admission was a small, bitter victory. It was proof that I had succeeded, that my work had spoken for itself. But it was also a cold, sharp reminder. A knife twist in the old wound. Even here, thousands of miles away, even in my greatest success, my father's shadow was still there, reaching out, trying to pull me back down. I had earned my place, but it seemed I would never outrun the legacy he had tried to deny me. Hill's voice, however, echoed louder. Welcome to the team, Black Widow. That was the family I was fighting for now. The respect I earned as the Black Widow forged a bond of professionalism with the SEAL teams. But it was in the crucible of personal loss that this bond was tempered into something far stronger, something that felt like family. It began with a phone call that shattered my carefully constructed world. The call came late on a Tuesday. It was my father. His voice was clipped, devoid of emotion, as if he were delivering a field report. Your mother has stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors say it's a matter of months. The line went dead before I could even process the words. The news wasn't just a shock. It was an amputation. My mother, Martha, was my anchor, my secret supporter, the quiet source of all my strength. And she was dying. I was on the first flight back to North Carolina, my request for emergency leave approved without question. My father was waiting for me at the Raleigh-Durham airport. The drive home was a study in suffocating silence. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't offer a word of comfort. He just stared straight ahead at the road, his jaw set like concrete. Finally, he spoke. Your mother doesn't want you to see her being weak, he said. And the cruelty of the statement stole the air from my lungs. He wasn't trying to protect my mother's pride. He was trying to manage a situation he couldn't control. To enforce discipline on death itself. Those last few weeks were a blur of antiseptic smells and hushed conversations. My father rarely entered my mother's room. He couldn't face the one battle he couldn't win with orders and aggression. He couldn't stand to witness the slow, inevitable surrender. So I was the one who sat by her bedside, holding her frail hand. reading to her from her favorite books of poetry. We didn't talk about the end. We didn't need to. We just were together, in the fading light. The funeral was a cold, formal affair. My father, in his immaculate dress blues, delivered a powerful eulogy about an officer's wife, praising her unwavering support for his career, her dedication to the military community. He spoke of her as if she were an extension of his own legacy, a supporting character in his story. He never once spoke of Martha, the woman who loved gardening, who laughed until she cried at silly movies, who secretly placed chocolate bars under her daughter's pillow. He eulogized a symbol, not the woman I knew as my mother. After the service, after the sympathetic murmurs and plates of untouched funeral sandwiches had vanished, I stood alone at her grave. The raw, red earth felt like an open wound. My father approached, his footsteps heavy on the grass. I braced myself, hoping for a single moment of shared grief, a single crack in his armor. "Don't stay out here too long," he commanded, his voice as cold as the marble headstone. "It looks weak." That was it. That was the moment I finally understood. The gap between us was no longer a trench, it was a canyon, a vast and uncrossable void. He was incapable of seeing my grief as anything other than a failure of discipline. Returning to Coronado was like coming up for air after being held under water. The grief was a physical weight, a shroud I couldn't seem to shake. In the solitude of my apartment, I found myself reading the books my mother had loved, searching for her wisdom. I picked up a book by an author she admired, Brené Brown. I read about courage and vulnerability, about how owning our stories of pain can make us stronger. I realized that my father saw vulnerability as a weakness to be hidden, while my mother had taught me it was a truth to be honored. Remembering her words, "Train for the harsh weather," I knew I couldn't let my grief become a destructive storm. It had to become something else. It had to become a mission. I started a small, unofficial ritual during my briefings. I noticed how the operators, these unbreakable men, would bottle everything up. They'd return from brutal deployments and pretend everything was fine. The standard, "How are you doing?" was always met with a stoic, "I'm good." It was a wall no one could get past, so I changed the question. At the end of a briefing, I'd look at the team and ask, "All right, what's the weather report?" They'd look at me, confused at first. I'd elaborate. "What's the weather inside? Sunny? Partly cloudy? Is there a storm coming in?" It was a simple, metaphorical shift, but it changed everything. It gave these warriors a new language, a safe way to talk about their internal state without feeling like they were admitting weakness. "A little cloudy on the horizon, ma'am," one might say. Or, "Forecast calls for a hurricane, but I've got it boarded up." It created a space for honesty, a quiet acknowledgement that even the strongest soldiers have internal battles. I had taken my mother's legacy and given it to them. In doing so, the teams became more than just my colleagues. They became my family. They remembered my birthday when my own father didn't. They listened patiently when I shared a story about my mom. They fiercely protected me from any whisper of gossip or disrespect on the base. One afternoon, a few weeks after I'd returned from the funeral, one of the quietest members of the team, a breacher named Jax who rarely said more than 3 words at a time, found me by the coffee machine. He didn't say anything. He just held out his hand. In his palm was a bracelet, intricately braided from black and tan paracord, the kind they make to pass the long, empty hours on deployment. I took it from him. He cleared his throat and looked at a spot on the wall just past my shoulder. "My mom died of cancer, too," he said, his voice a low rumble, and then he just nodded and walked away. That small gesture, that simple, shared truth, meant more to me than 1,000 empty platitudes. It was an anchor in my storm. I realized I had spent my entire life chasing the approval of a man who was incapable of giving it. I had been knocking on a locked door, begging to be let in, while a real family had been building itself around me all along. A family forged not by blood, but by shared risk, mutual respect, and the quiet understanding of a paracord bracelet. One day, a care package arrived for me at the office. It was a large cardboard box with no return address. Inside, it was filled not with expensive gifts, but with things they knew I liked: a bag of my favorite dark roast coffee, beef jerky, a new thriller novel. Tucked inside was a handwritten note on a crumpled piece of paper. It was short and to the point. "Weather at home is stormy," it read, "but it's always clear skies here. Your family." The contrast with my father's cold silence was a gut punch. That box, filled with cheap snacks and a paperback book, was the warmest homecoming I had ever known. My family in Coronado had given me a safe harbor, a place where the weather was always clear. But you can't outrun a storm forever. Sometimes you have to fly back into it. I had no intention of coming home for this leave. My plan was simple: decompress in San Diego, maybe drive up the coast. But a phone call from Mrs. Gable, my mother's old friend from her gardening club, changed everything. Her voice was hesitant, laced with concern. "Tegan, dear, your father. He's selling some of Martha's things. An estate sale." The words hit me with a cold, sickening thud. He wasn't just clearing out a room, he was erasing her. I knew then that I had to go back. Not for a confrontation, not for him. I was going back on a recovery mission, to save what was left of my mother's memory. The moment I stepped into my childhood home, I knew I was too late. My mother's room, once a sanctuary of soft colors, books, and the faint scent of lavender, had been sterilized. Her bookshelves were gone, replaced by glass cases displaying my father's military medals and commendations. Her beautiful oak vanity was gone, a sterile filing cabinet in its place. He had turned her space into a museum for himself. "Had to clear out the non-essentials," he stated, walking into the room without so much as a hello. For him, the memory of his own wife was non-essential, a liability, an attachment to be cut away, just like my childhood dog. Before I could even respond, I heard a thud from the backyard. I walked to the kitchen window and saw him with a young man I didn't recognize, strong, confident, the same Navy SEAL I would later see at the VFW hall. My father was showing him how to throw an axe at a large wooden target he'd set up against an old oak tree. The young man, Remy, threw, and the axe sank into the wood with a satisfying thwack. My father clapped him on the shoulder, a wide, proud grin on his face. "Good job, son," he boomed. Son. The word wasn't just a word. It was a gunshot in the quiet of my heart, a term of endearment and approval he had never, not once, used with anyone. He had found his replacement. He had found the son he always wanted, and he was parading him in the backyard of the home he was systematically purging of my mother. I felt a surge of something cold and sharp, but it wasn't the hot shame of my youth. It was the icy calm of a strategist assessing a battlefield. I knew then that the event at the VFW hall that night wasn't just a ceremony to honor him. It was a stage. He had intentionally invited Remy, this perfect symbol of his legacy, to create a public spectacle. A carefully orchestrated drama where he could finally, definitively, present his chosen heir to the whole town and cast me out once and for all. A part of me wanted to turn around, get back in my rental car, and drive straight to the airport. But I didn't. He didn't get to control this narrative. I wasn't going for him. I was going for them. The other veterans in that hall. The men who had served with integrity. The ones who had been real friends to my mother. The ones who deserved respect. I would go to honor them, and I would not be chased out of my own hometown by his pathetic theater. So I went. I walked into that hall, felt the familiar awkwardness, endured his dismissive gaze, and found my corner. I watched him work the room, a politician on campaign, shaking hands, accepting praise. I was an observer, detached, analyzing his movements. When the mayor began to speak, and my father cut him off to turn the spotlight on me, I was ready. I felt the weight of every eye in the room land on me, a heavy, suffocating blanket. But this time, something was different inside me. The searing heat of shame I would have felt years ago was gone. In its place was a strange, chilling calm. I've been in rooms where the stakes were life and death. I've listened to enemy communications, knowing that a single misinterpretation could get my entire team killed. I felt the ground shake from controlled detonations and briefed men who were about to step into the dark, not knowing if they'd come back. His words, as cruel as they were, The answer is no. Nothing but a disappointment. Not a real soldier. We're just noise. Static. They were the desperate pronouncements of a king whose crown was slipping. His power over me was an illusion, one I had helped maintain for years by caring what he thought. But I didn't care anymore. I had another family now, a brotherhood and sisterhood that had been forged in real fire, not in the hollow halls of memory. His words couldn't hurt me because his opinion was no longer a currency I valued. I held his gaze, my face a mask of military impassivity. I let him perform his little play, let him present his replacement son to the applauding crowd. I saw the triumphant smirk on his face, the final pathetic flourish of a man who had to publicly destroy his own daughter to feel strong. It wasn't powerful, it was pathetic. And then, the script changed. The moment Remy spoke my call sign, the moment he uttered the name Black Widow, the entire dynamic of the room fractured. Time seemed to slow down. I saw it all with perfect clarity. The applause dying in an instant, the confused whispers rippling through the crowd, the smiles freezing on the faces of my father's friends. Most of all, I saw my father's face. For the first time in my entire life, I saw him lose control. The confident, commanding mask fell away, revealing a flicker of raw, genuine confusion. His arrogance faltered. He had built this perfect, controlled world where he was the unquestioned monarch and I was the designated outcast. His narrative was absolute. But now a stranger had walked onto his stage. A soldier from the very world he worshipped, the world he used as his ultimate standard of worth. And that soldier had just brought a truth into the room from the outside. A truth that didn't fit my father's story. A truth that threatened to shatter the very foundation of his carefully constructed kingdom. I stood there, in the sudden, deafening silence, and I knew. No matter what happened next, no matter how he tried to spin it or dismiss it, nothing would ever be the same again. And then, in a trembling voice, but one clear enough for everyone nearby to hear, Remy asked the question that changed everything. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but are you the Black Widow of the SEALs?" For a long second, the only sound in the VFW hall was the hum of the beer cooler. Remy's question hung in the air, electric and dangerous. My father, caught completely off guard, recovered with the speed of a seasoned officer rallying from an ambush. He forced a hearty, dismissive laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. He clapped Remy on the shoulder, a gesture that was now less paternal and more patronizing. "You must be mistaken, son," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "That's probably a cute little nickname the boys give the ladies in logistics to make them feel important." He tried to turn it into a joke, a harmless misunderstanding for the whole room to chuckle at. Then, to solidify his point, he added with a sneer, directing his words to the crowd. "Black Widow sounds like something out of a comic book. My daughter is an analyst. She sits behind a desk and plays with numbers while real men fight and die." His words were a fresh assault, designed to reduce my entire career to a clerical error, to paint me as a child playing make-believe. But his attempt to regain control backfired. Remy didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. He took a small step away from my father, subtly shrugging off his hand. The look of awe in the young SEAL's eyes had been replaced by something else. Disappointment. "With all due respect, sir," Remy said, his voice now steady and hard as steel. "She does more than just paperwork." He turned away from my father, addressing the silent, watching crowd as if they were a jury. His voice rang with an authority that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with truth. "Last year, my team was on a rotation in Helmand Province, Afghanistan. We walked into a complex ambush. We were pinned down, outgunned, and taking heavy fire from 3 sides. Comms were screaming. High command was telling us to pull back, to accept losses and retreat." He took a deep, steadying breath, and the entire room seemed to breathe with him. But then there was another voice on the radio, a voice that was completely calm. It was her. It was the Black Widow. He gestured toward me, not as a colonel's daughter, but as a figure on a battlefield. She saw an escape route on the satellite feed that no one else did. A dry creek bed that wasn't on our maps. It was our only way out. His eyes scanned the faces of the veterans in the room, men who understood the language of impossible situations. She walked us out of that kill box, step by step. She talked us through every bound, calling out enemy positions from miles away while RPGs were hitting the walls around us. She was our eyes, our lifeline. We were supposed to be the casualties that day. Instead, every single one of us got out, not one man left behind. The room was utterly still, captivated. The story, delivered with the raw honesty of a soldier who had lived it, was more powerful than any speech my father could ever give. Remy then turned and looked directly at me. The professional respect was gone, replaced by a look of profound, personal gratitude that hit me harder than any of my father's insults. "We are all alive today because of her," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The fact that I can still send a card to my own mother on Mother's Day is because of her." He said nothing more. He didn't need to. He simply straightened to his full height and gave me a sharp, formal nod. The highest sign of respect one warrior can give another. The silence that followed was no longer one of shocked humiliation for me. It was a silence of awe, a silence of reverence. I watched my father's face. The color had drained from it, leaving behind a pale, waxy mask. Every word he had spoken just minutes before, disappointment, paper pusher, not a real soldier, now hung in the air, exposed as hollow, ignorant, and cruel. He had built his entire identity, his entire kingdom, on the respect of the military community. And now, a Navy SEAL, the very pinnacle of that world, had just stood in a room full of his peers and declared his rejected daughter a hero. My eyes met his across the room. I felt no triumph, no desire for revenge, just a quiet, unshakable certainty. I had spent a lifetime trying to prove my worth to him, to sell him on the idea that I was enough. And now, I didn't have to. The truth had done it for me. "I don't need to sell you on anything, Colonel," I said. My voice was quiet, barely a whisper, but in the dead silence of the room, I knew he heard me. "I'm just standing where you can finally see me." There's a special kind of justice when a bully is silenced by their own rules. If you've ever had a moment where the truth finally spoke for you, hit that like button. And in the comments, just type the word testify if you believe one voice telling the truth can be louder than 1,000 lies. He stood there, speechless, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. The plaque naming him Honorary Citizen of the Year sat on the podium, forgotten. His legacy was in ashes at his feet. But the story wasn't over. The shift in power was not yet complete. From the back of the room, there was a scraping sound of a chair on the worn linoleum floor. An old man was slowly, deliberately, getting to his feet. After Remy's testimony, the silence in the room was no longer just an absence of noise. It was a living thing, thick with unspoken judgment, and it was suffocating my father. And then, from a table in the back corner, came the soft scrape of a chair leg against the worn linoleum floor. One man was getting to his feet. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if every joint ached with the memory of a long-ago war. It was Mr. Peterson, a Marine Corps veteran who had fought at Khe Sanh during Vietnam. His hair was white and thin, his back stooped from age, but he pulled himself up to his full height, his spine as straight as he could make it. I knew him mostly through my father's dismissive descriptions. That cranky old man, he'd call him. My father had always looked down on him, a corporal who never made rank. Mr. Peterson didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He simply looked at me across the room, and with a slow, solemn movement, he placed his gnarled, work-worn hand over his heart. It wasn't a salute. It wasn't a military protocol. It was a human gesture, a profound and quiet statement of respect that went deeper than any regulation. He wasn't acknowledging a lieutenant commander. He was seeing a fellow soldier. His action was a single pebble dropped into a still, silent pond. And the ripples began to spread. A woman near the front, a Desert Storm Air Force veteran, stood up. Then another man, who had served in Iraq, pushed his chair back and rose. One by one, then in small groups, then in a silent, undeniable wave, they stood. The men and women of Fayetteville, the quiet heroes of the Gulf War, of Afghanistan, of conflicts whose names were fading from headlines but were etched forever into their souls. They all rose from their seats, a forest of quiet dignity growing in the crowded hall. They didn't speak, they didn't applaud, they just stood, and they looked at me. In their eyes, I saw not pity, but recognition. They weren't seeing the colonel's disappointing daughter. They were seeing one of their own. They were welcoming me into a family I never knew I had. A family bound not by blood, but by a shared oath and a silent understanding of sacrifice. I watched my father. His head swiveled from side to side, his eyes darting around the room, desperately searching for an ally, for a single friendly face that remained seated with him. But there were none. The entire room, his audience, his kingdom, was now standing in silent tribute to the daughter he had just disowned. He, Colonel Robert Miller, the man who was always the center of attention, the guest of honor, was now an island. He sat alone at his table, utterly isolated by a rising tide of respect that was not meant for him. For the first time in my life, I saw him not as a towering figure of authority, but as a small, lonely old man. The armor of his medals and his rank, once so intimidating, now looked flimsy and useless. It couldn't protect him from this. It couldn't protect him from the quiet, collective judgment of his peers. Tears welled in my eyes, blurring the faces before me into a sea of supportive figures. I thought of a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. that my mother used to read to me. In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. But tonight, these people, my brothers and sisters in arms, were not silent. Their actions spoke with a thunderous voice that drowned out every cruel word my father had ever said. I took a deep, shaky breath, letting the moment settle in my soul, letting it heal the old, raw wounds of rejection. I looked across the room, meeting the eyes of Mr. Peterson, of the woman from the Air Force, of dozens of others who were standing for me. Then my gaze came to rest on my father, who was now staring at his hands on the table, unable to look at me, unable to look at anyone. My voice, when I spoke, was steady. It was not loud, but it carried the weight of a lifetime of struggle and a single moment of absolute vindication. Respect isn't inherited, Colonel, I said, my voice clear and calm. It's earned. Sometimes it's earned in classified rooms that no one ever sees, and sometimes it's earned right here. A single tear traced a path down my cheek, but it wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of release, of homecoming. The community had become my witness. The blood of my father had rejected me, but the bond of honor had finally welcomed me home. Looking at my father, so diminished and alone, I felt the anger that had fueled me for so long finally begin to dissolve. It left behind not a feeling of triumph, but a quiet, aching sadness for the man he was, and for the father he could never be. I knew then that this public trial was over. But there was one more conversation we needed to have, not in a hall full of people, but in the quiet of the house where it all began. The next morning, I drove back to my childhood home. The sunlight felt different today, softer, less accusing. The house itself seemed smaller than I remembered, the paint peeling slightly at the edges, the proud military bearing of its architecture now looking tired and worn. It looked like what it was, a house where a great deal of time had passed, and not all of it kindly. I found him at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd done my homework for 12 years under his watchful, critical eye. He looked like he had aged a decade overnight. His broad shoulders were slumped, his back stooped. He didn't look like a colonel anymore. He just looked like an old man. He was fiddling with an old transistor radio, its plastic casing cracked and yellowed with age. He twisted the dials, but only static hissed back at him. It was a futile act. A man trying to tune into a signal that was no longer broadcasting, trying to fix a connection that had long been broken. He didn't look up when I walked in. I poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the counter and set one down in front of him. I sat in the chair opposite him, the same chair I'd always sat in. The silence between us was different now. It wasn't the heavy, punishing silence of my youth. This was a fragile silence, born of embarrassment and failure. We sat there for a long time, the only sound the useless hiss of the radio and the ticking of the clock in the hall. The steam rising from our coffee cups thinned and vanished, leaving two cold black pools between us. Finally, he pushed the radio aside and cleared his throat. His voice, when he spoke, was raspy and low, stripped of its usual command. I didn't know. 4 words. Not an apology, not an excuse. A confession. A confession of ignorance, of a willful blindness that had spanned my entire life. And somehow it was heavier, more meaningful than any "I'm sorry" could ever be. I didn't respond. I just let the words hang in the air, let them settle into the quiet of the room. I spent my whole life, he began, his gaze fixed on the dark surface of his coffee. My whole life building a legacy, something that would last, something strong. He shook his head slowly, a gesture of profound weariness. And I was too damn blind to see that it was sitting right here at my own table, the whole time. He finally looked at me, and for the first time, I saw not a commander, but a man reckoning with his own catastrophic failure. I wanted a son, he said, the truth laid bare and ugly. Someone to follow in my footsteps. I was so disappointed when you weren't him that I let that poison everything. I let it define how I saw you. I just listened. The rage that had been a constant companion for so many years, the burning indignation, it was gone. In its place was only a deep, profound sadness. A sadness for the little girl who had tried so desperately to earn his love, and a sadness for the old man who had wasted a lifetime chasing a ghost when his real legacy was right in front of him. I was wrong, Tegan, he said, and the sound of my name in his voice was so unfamiliar that it startled me. I looked at you, but I never really saw you. It wasn't an excuse, it was the simple, unvarnished truth. And in that moment, I understood. He wasn't a monster. He was just a man, trapped in his own rigid, narrow vision of the world, a prisoner of his own definition of strength. And his prison had cost him everything. It had cost him his wife's final years. It had cost him his daughter. We sat in silence again for a few moments. I had come for closure, and in a strange, unexpected way, I had found it. The battle was over. There was nothing left to fight for. I pushed my chair back and stood up to leave. Tegan, he said, his voice stopping me. It was quiet, hesitant, almost a plea. If you had another one of those promotion ceremonies, would there be a place for me? The question hung in the air, so full of hope and fear. This man who had never asked for anything was asking for a place, not demanding it, asking. I turned back and looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the flicker of terror in his eyes that I might say no. Always, I said, and I meant it. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It wasn't a promise that everything would be okay. But it was a possibility. It was a door left unlocked. As I reached the doorway, he called out my name one last time. I paused, my hand on the frame. Proud, he said, the word catching in his throat. He cleared it and tried again, his voice cracking. I am proud of you, even if I never knew how to say it. I walked out of that house and into the morning sunlight, leaving the colonel behind. In his place was just my father, an old man sitting alone at his kitchen table, trying to find a clear signal in the static. Leaving my father's house, I didn't feel like a victor. There was no sweet taste of triumph, no satisfaction from winning a war. There was only a vast, hollow emptiness. For my entire life, I had been fighting a battle, convinced that the finish line was my father's approval. I realized now that I had been fighting for the wrong prize. The real finish line wasn't his acceptance. It was my own. I didn't go back to the hotel. Instead, I drove to a quiet lake on the outskirts of town, a place my mother and I used to walk. I sat on a weathered wooden bench overlooking the still, gray water and just let the world be silent for a while. The complex emotions washed over me in waves. The relief of the confrontation, the sadness for a relationship that would never be what I wanted, the profound sense of loss for all the years we could have had. I just sat there, letting the storm inside me finally quiet down. That afternoon, I went back to the house one last time to pack the few remaining boxes of my mother's belongings. In the back of her closet, tucked away under a stack of old blankets, I found a small wooden letter box. My heart clenched. Inside, I found a stack of letters bound with a faded ribbon. They were my letters. All the letters I'd sent home over the years from Annapolis, from my various posts, still sealed in their envelopes, postmarked, and untouched. A familiar hot surge of anger rose in my throat. He hadn't even bothered to open them. But then, underneath them, I found something else. A stack of thin airmail paper covered in my mother's elegant looping script. They were drafts, dozens of them. Letters she had written to me, but had never sent. Page after page was filled with the words I had longed to hear. My dearest Tegan, I am so incredibly proud of you. Stay strong, my little eagle. Don't let anyone tell you how high you can fly. I read about your unit in the paper today, and my heart swelled with pride. She had been there all along, my silent champion, fighting her own quiet war against my father's suffocating disapproval. She was a dissident in her own home, her love a form of secret resistance. My tears fell onto the yellowed paper, not tears of anger anymore, but tears of understanding. Of love. I had never been truly alone. Her support had always been there, just silenced. With that realization, something inside me shifted permanently. I began to think about forgiveness. Not the kind you see in movies where everything is forgotten and everyone hugs in the end. I couldn't erase the years of pain. I couldn't forget the calculated cruelty. But I could choose to stop carrying it. I thought of a book my mother loved, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. There was a line in it that had always stayed with me. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. My father's actions were the stimulus. My anger and my desperate need for his approval had been my response for 32 years. Now, in that quiet space Frankl wrote about, I finally found the freedom to choose a different response. Forgiveness for me wasn't about absolving him. It was about liberating myself. It was the act of handing him back the weight of his own actions instead of carrying them on my shoulders for the rest of my life. It was a boundary, not a bridge. Before I left town, I sat down and wrote him a short letter. It wasn't angry or accusatory. It was a redrawing of the map of our relationship. Dad, I wrote, I will always be your daughter. But I am also a naval officer, a leader, and a woman who has found her own way in the world. I hope that one day you can learn to respect all of those things. I sealed it and left it on the kitchen table where he would find it. My last stop was the cemetery. I walked to my mother's grave, the fresh earth now covered with a neat square of green sod. The air was cool and still. I didn't cry. I just stood there, feeling a sense of peace that had been a stranger for so long. I had kept my unspoken promise to her. I had trained for the harsh weather. I had flown into the storm and come out the other side. I placed a single wild Queen Anne's lace, her favorite, on the grave. I'm okay, Mom, I whispered to the gentle breeze, the words feeling truer than anything I had ever said. The weather inside me is finally clear. It was a goodbye to the little girl who had spent her life fighting for her father's love, and a quiet hello to the woman who no longer needed it. It was a new beginning. When I returned to Coronado, the word home no longer felt like a complicated, painful puzzle. Home was the warm California sun on my face. Home was the salty air of the Pacific. Home was walking back into my office and seeing the faces of my team. They didn't ask questions about my leave. They didn't need to. There was just a quiet understanding, a series of knowing nods that said, "Welcome back, we've got your six." Remy found me later that day, catching me as I was grabbing a coffee. He was hesitant, the bravado of a young SEAL replaced by a quiet humility. "Commander," he said, using my official title. "I just wanted to say, thank you. For everything." I knew he wasn't just talking about Helmand. He was talking about the VFW hall, about speaking a truth he didn't have to. I just nodded. We both understood. I realized then that my father's definition of legacy, a name carved on a memorial stone, a bloodline to carry on a military tradition, was so small, so hollow. My legacy wasn't a name. It was the safety of these soldiers. It was the unspoken trust in their eyes. It was Remy being able to send that Mother's Day card. My reputation, not just as the Black Widow, but as a leader who cared about the weather within, began to spread. The story of what happened at the VFW Hall, told in whispers and anecdotes by Remy and his team, took on a life of its own. And then, an invitation arrived that brought my journey full circle. It was from the United States Naval Academy. They wanted me to be a guest speaker for their leadership seminar. Annapolis. The very place my father had declared was no place for girls. Standing on that stage, looking out at the sea of bright, determined faces of the next generation of officers, I felt a profound sense of peace. I didn't talk about signals intelligence or ambush tactics. I talked about people. Respect, I told them, my voice steady and clear, is not an emotion. It's logistics. It's ensuring your people have the resources, both mental and physical, to do their job, to fight the fight, and to come home whole. It's creating an environment where asking for help isn't a sign of weakness, but a critical part of the mission. That is the true legacy of a leader. Not the battles you win, but the soldiers you bring home. Several months passed. Life settled into a new, healthier rhythm. I was working, leading, and building my chosen family. Then, one day, a package arrived at my apartment. It was a flat rectangular box with my father's handwriting on the label. My hands were steady as I opened it. Inside, resting on a bed of bubble wrap, was the Honorary Citizen of the Year plaque from that night at the VFW Hall. It had been carefully removed from its wooden frame. I turned it over. On the back, in my father's shaky, unfamiliar script, were 5 words. They gave this to the wrong person. Underneath the plaque was a small, faded photograph I hadn't seen in years. It was a picture of me as a little girl, maybe 7 years old, sitting on my mother's lap in her garden, both of us laughing with wild, uninhibited joy. It was a picture from a time before the silence, before the discipline, before I became a disappointment. I didn't feel a surge of triumph. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt a deep, quiet ache, a sense of profound peace mixed with the sadness of what could have been. He hadn't changed completely. I knew that. But this was a start. This was him, in his own way, trying to tune into a signal he had ignored for decades. I didn't hang the plaque on my wall. Instead, I opened the wooden box where I kept my mother's unsent letters, and I placed the plaque and the photograph inside with her words of pride. My legacy didn't need a public display. It belonged here, with hers. The story ends not with a grand reconciliation, but with a quiet sense of order. It ends with me, back in a briefing room, standing in front of a complex world map, outlining a new mission. I look at the map, at the intricate web of threats and opportunities. Then I look at the faces of my team, the men who trust me with their lives. And I know, with a certainty that settles deep in my bones, that I am exactly where I'm supposed to be. The sweetest revenge, I've learned, isn't seeing your father humiliated. It's standing up so straight and tall that you remind him he has a spine of his own. Maybe he's not standing perfectly straight yet, but he's trying. That night at the VFW Hall, my bloodline didn't claim me, but my honor did. And that is the only legacy that truly matters. And so, my story isn't really about a father and a daughter anymore. It's about the families we choose, the legacies we build for ourselves, and the incredible strength that comes from turning pain into purpose. Thank you for walking this path with me. If this story resonated with you, and if you believe that our true worth is defined not by where we come from, but by the honor we create, please hit that like button and subscribe. Share your own stories of resilience in the comments below, because every voice adds to our collective strength. Remember, you are the author of your own legacy.